Resident Evil month continues, everyone. It is Resident Evil month. I've been revisiting a lot of the old Resident Evil games, been playing a lot of them, and seeing as how they're all fresh in my mind, I thought this would be a cool opportunity to look back at the mainline series and rank them from worst to best. Jesus Christ. So if we look at Resident Evil Remake and Resident Evil for the PS1 as two separate games, because they pretty much are two different games, and we also include Code Veronica as a mainline in the series, then we have a total of 10 games to look at. So from 10 being the lowest and number 1 being the highest, let's start at number 10. Resident Evil 6. Now, look, I know Resident Evil 6 is an easy game to pick on. It's easy to single out Resident Evil 6 and say it's the worst in the series, and when I was coming up with my list and putting everything in order, I just couldn't justify putting it anywhere else but at number 10. Now, I know I put it at the bottom of the list, but don't get me wrong, I don't hate Resident Evil 6. Now, it has a lot of problems. It has a shitload of problems. It has 7 main playable characters across 4 intertwining campaigns. That it's just a bloated mess. It's completely unfocused. They're trying to throw a million things into a single game and it just didn't work out. This game is so over-designed. It's so over-designed. I think it's the best way I can describe it. The number of QuickTime events in this game, it's you don't need to put a QuickTime event to open a door. You just don't. It doesn't make it more fun. But that's not to say the game's entirely bad. There are moments where the game really does shine. They're just few and far between, and there's a lot of just bloat. There's turret sequences, there's driving sequences. They just threw so much shit at the wall, and half of it, I would say 3/4 of it doesn't stick. They brought back a ton of characters into this game. As I said, there's 7 playable characters. And they did some great things with some characters. I really liked Sherry Birkin's character in this game. And then they totally screwed it up for some other characters. They turned Chris Redfield into an alcoholic. Are you kidding me? But again, I don't hate Resident Evil 6, but there's no doubt that it belongs at the bottom of the list. Number 9 on my list is Resident Evil Code Veronica. I know that this is going to come as a big surprise to a lot of people. I know a lot of people like Resident Evil Code Veronica, and why do I own so many copies of Code Veronica? I got Dreamcast, I got Gamecube and PS2. I also own this game digitally on PS4. For a game that's lower on my list, I gotta stop buying it. Jesus Christ. I think for me, the biggest problem I had with Code Veronica was the setting. In the previous games, you were exploring mansions and, creepy police departments and destroyed cities, and the setting has always been such a big part of what makes a Resident Evil game. It's the atmosphere. And Code Veronica takes place primarily at this military facility. It just feels very bland and very sterile and uninteresting that I had a hard time getting into it. Claire Redfield is a badass in this game. It's got that going for it. She's got that sick scene where she's in a standoff with the guys and she drops her gun, but then she catches her gun and then shoots them. It's so sick. And I know a lot of people like to give shit to the original Resident Evil 1 for having terrible voice acting, but Code Veronica has a certain character in it named Steve Burnside who might just have some of the worst dialogue in any Resident Evil game, period.
Relax, beautiful. I said I was sorry. My name's Steve.
And this is the 4th game in the series to still have terrible voice acting from Steve. It's just, there's no excuse. It's terrible.
Shut up! I don't want to talk about it!
Coming in at number 8 is Resident Evil 0 for the Nintendo Gamecube. It was a Gamecube exclusive. Also got a really sick HD remaster a few years back. They had a lot of cool ideas with this game. They brought back the 2 playable characters. You would play both characters at the same time, and you would actively switch characters on the fly. You can put them in different parts of the level, or you can have them both following together. It was a pretty interesting mechanic, but I think after the novelty of switching characters on the fly kind of wears off, it became almost more of a frustration. I also think Resident Evil 0, out of all of the mainline games, might have the least interesting protagonists. I think that's also one of its biggest issues. Rebecca's okay, she's from the first game, she's kind of a classic, but she was always kind of a secondary character. I don't know if she's really interesting or compelling enough to headline her own game. And then Billy's just kind of there. He's kind of bland and uninteresting. Billy might have some of the worst video game tattoos out of any character in video game history. So it's of course a prequel to the original Resident Evil game, And the game starts off by taking place on a train, and I thought the entire train sequence of the game was awesome. Definitely the highlight of the game, but the problem is only about 20%, maybe a quarter, 25% of the game actually takes place on the train. After the train, get this, you're at another mansion. But wait, you're in this mansion, it self-destructs, and then Rebecca, what does she do? She goes and she takes refuge in another mansion? It's like, why does it go to another mansion? It really doesn't make any sense. The list definitely gets pretty difficult from here on out. Coming in at number 7, I have the original Resident Evil. So this is the original game. This is what started everything. Arguably, it could be at the top of the list for that reason alone. It single-handedly created a genre. It created the survival horror genre. Multiple endings, iconic boss fights, some of the most famous lines of dialogue in a video game ever. Like, the dialogue is so infamous at this point, and I know a lot of people say it's terrible and it's bad and it's cheesy, but that's part of the charm. Like, I don't know if this game really was self-aware or they knew that the voice acting was bad.
You were almost a Jill sandwich.
You're right. Barry, thanks for saving my life.
But to me, it just makes the experience. Despite looking super dated by today's standards, I still think the game is incredibly fun to go back and play. Coming in at number 6 is Resident Evil 5, the highest selling Resident Evil game in the entire franchise. Now, I know a lot of Resident Evil fans don't like to give credit to Resident Evil 5, want to cast it aside and say it's not a real Resident Evil game just because it doesn't fit their idea of what Resident Evil should be. But we gotta take this for what it is. This is a mainline Resident Evil game. It is a major departure for the series, and that's why a lot of people don't like it, but I feel like the community is also a little divided on it because it does have its defenders as well. In my opinion, Resident Evil 5 is a really fun action horror game. Chris Redfield from the first game is back. He looks better than ever, and he's on steroids or some shit, and that's kind of Resident Evil 5 in a nutshell itself. The game looks better than ever. Resident Evil 5 still looks really good by today's standards, and it's on steroids. Like, the game is definitely stupid. The game is definitely stupid. Turns the action up to 11. It's got turret sequences, explosions, boulder punching. It doesn't make any goddamn sense. It was also the first mainline Resident Evil game to be playable entirely in co-op. This was also a point of contention for some people, thinking that, it kind of took away from that sense of isolation and made the game less scary because of that. Resident Evil 5, in my opinion, was never really scary to begin with. It's just a really fun action game, and playing it in co-op is actually still a blast. I really like Resident Evil 5. I'm probably in the minority of Resident Evil fans who can say that, but, even 10 years later, this game is approaching its 10-year anniversary. Even 10 years later, the game is still extremely fun to play, especially in co-op. Still looks amazing as well. Next, I gotta give it to Resident Evil 3 Nemesis. This is a sealed copy. This is the Gamecube version. You know what? The thing I like about Resident Evil 3 Nemesis the most is Nemesis himself. I'm of the mind that a good villain, a good monster, a good antagonist is equally as important as the protagonist. Nemesis is freaking badass. So Resident Evil 3 was released hot on the heels of the success of Resident Evil 2, and it reuses a lot of the assets. You're going through Raccoon City. The graphics are pretty much the same. They literally reusing a bunch of the assets, and you're going to the same locales. You go back to the RPD, and it's telling a story that takes place at the same time as Resident Evil 2, and because of that, it came under a little bit of scrutiny. But to me, the game made up for it, because despite looking the same and running on the same engine, using a bunch of the same assets, all of that stuff, the game still came out with a bunch of new ideas. Jill Valentine is back from Resident Evil 1. She's got a super iconic look in this game, and just the idea of having Nemesis follow you, and he's like a random encounter. There's also some scripted encounters as well. Just the same guy, the same monster, kind of pursuing you throughout the entire game. That was something that never really had been done before. Going into a new area and then just having Nemesis spawn on you, and he's saying stars, and he's running after your ass. That shit was terrifying. It was such an adrenaline rush. Now, coming in at number 4 is Resident Evil 7, a huge departure for the series, but I think totally for the better. Resident Evil 7 was such a risky game, but it was a risk that Capcom needed to make. You have a game that's from a new perspective, built to be fully 100% compatible with VR, has 0 recognizable characters from an established franchise. The game was a huge risk, but one that I'm really glad that Capcom took. Arguably the scariest game in the entire franchise, especially if you're playing in VR. It definitely is the scariest game. You know, I really think Resident Evil 7 kind of kicked off like the Capcom Renaissance. You know, there was a period of time where Capcom was really struggling with several of its franchises. You know, Resident Evil 6 was critically panned. DMC didn't quite do the numbers they were wanting. You know, Mega Man disappeared. But then Resident Evil 7 came out, and that was like what kicked off the Capcom Renaissance that we kind of find ourselves in now. Now, Resident Evil 7 does have its critics. Some people think it's too much of a departure, too much of a change from the series. But I'm just like, what? Resident Evil 7 is a Resident Evil-ass Resident Evil game. It's got item boxes, inventory management. You find yourself in a mansion, the Big Baker estate, trying to find keys that are hidden behind elaborate puzzles. It is such a Resident Evil game, simply from a different perspective and with no recognizable characters. Alright, we're in the top 3 now. All of these games, in the top 3 especially, are all masterpieces in my opinion. But coming in at number 3, I gotta give it to Resident Evil 2. Hands down the best PlayStation era Resident Evil game. Introduced my favorite Resident Evil character, Leon Kennedy. Also introduced Claire Redfield, Ada Wong, just all of these classic characters. It was just so much bigger and so much more ambitious than Resident Evil 1. I think it really caught a lot of people off guard. The game essentially has 4 different campaigns where things can unravel vastly differently, depending on which character you start with, and something you do in one campaign can affect another campaign. You really want to play the game multiple times to get like the true ending. There's tons of post-game content as well. It was the first game directed by Hideki Kamiya, who went on to direct games like Devil May Cry, Beautiful Joe, Okami, Bayonetta. The dude's a legend now, and it all started with Resident Evil 2. For number 2, I gotta give it to Resident Evil 4. This could arguably be number 1. I'm sure it is on a lot of other people's lists, but I gotta save the number 1 slot. What can I say about Resident Evil 4 that hasn't been said a million times over? This game is so influential, so important, not just for Resident Evil, but for video games in general. This is the game that pioneered the off-center, over-the-shoulder perspective and aiming and shooting. It's like after Resident Evil 4, the way third-person games were made changed. So many games today, nearly 15 years later, god damn, 15 years later, have bits of Resident Evil 4's DNA within it, just based on the way the camera is angled and the shooting mechanics. This game was really revolutionary. Leon Kennedy is back, Ada is back, the story is so sick. Leon is like a superhero in this game. This is, Resident Evil 4 is definitely the game that kind of sent Resident Evil down a more action-based path, but Resident Evil 4 still retains quite a bit of horror, which is why it doesn't get nearly as much flack as Resident Evil 5 does. And I think Resident Evil 4, more than just about any other game in the franchise, really gives you a sense of dread, especially when you're being attacked by like a dozen plus villagers all at the same time, and you're barricading yourself in the house, and they're putting ladders up against the windows, and you're just severely outnumbered, and you're panicking. No other game gives you that feeling quite like Resident Evil 4 does. Everyone loves the Resident Evil 4 merchant, and just like upgrading your guns was like super addictive, and I would want to like play through the game more than once, just to be able to run through the game a second time with all of my upgraded shit. This game was so fun. Resident Evil 4 could be number 1, but it's number 2. For number 1, I gotta give it to the quintessential Resident Evil experience, that is Resident Evil Remake, originally released back on the Gamecube, I want to say back 2002, 2003. It still looks so good. But you could also get the HD remastered versions, which just look insane. Some of these pre-rendered backgrounds, I swear, are like photorealistic. No other game has nearly the level of atmosphere that Resident Evil Remake has. It took absolutely everything about the first game, about the PlayStation original, and improved upon it like tenfold. Introduced some new areas, introduced a new monster, new villain in Lisa Trevor, who's absolutely terrifying. It still has all of the classic moments, all the classic boss fights. They redid all of the dialogue for the game, which is kind of a shame. I think I was about 13 years old when this game came out back in the day, and I very distinctly remember renting this game for the Nintendo Gamecube back when it first came out, and it just scared the shit out of me. And I don't know why, I was a weird kid, I guess, but there was something about that feeling of just being fucking terrified. It was enticing. It was enticing to me. I was a weird kid. What can I say? No other game ever like struck a chord with me like that before. And I still replay it at least once or twice a year, even to this day. Resident Evil Remake, hands down, the quintessential must-play Resident Evil experience. If you're to start anywhere, if you've never played a Resident Evil game before in your life, this is the place to start. Anyways, that is my list of the mainline Resident Evil games ranked from worst to best. Let me know in the comments section whether you guys agree, disagree, think I'm crazy. Tell me how wrong my opinion is, please. And thank you so much for watching this video. Peace out.